Hi, so I'm going to talk about mountains and molecules, which are important things in my life. And it all started at my freshman chemistry class at Reed College. My chemistry professor was 23. She had a PhD from MIT in chemistry, which is unusual in these days. She thought chemistry was the coolest subject on the planet. And there were 4 girls in my class. We all got doctorates in chemistry, which is not that usual. Very inspirational. And after that, I started, my lab partner, my chemistry lab partner was a mountain climber, and we used to study chemistry and climb mountains. And I climbed mountains all over the world, and I guess I'm already at my Harvard Mountaineering Club story, but at that point, Harvard Mountaineering Club was just famous that they had done expeditions in Alaska, and I really wanted to do climbing expeditions. So I decided I wanted to go to Harvard for graduate school and join the Harvard Mountaineering Club. And I got accepted to Harvard, and I came for a visit, and I met the president of the Mountaineering Club, who told me that women could not be members of the Mountaineering Club. And they didn't have a hiking club then. And I was so shocked that I went to MIT, which had a hiking club. And I actually did, and joined the MIT outing club called MITAC. And actually, it was not the most, MIT was not the greatest place for a woman back then. It was uncomfortable. So then I transferred to Berkeley, which is where I got my doctorate. And the next part of the story happens after I passed my qualifying exams in chemistry at Berkeley. I heard about it. And can everyone hear me okay? Is the audio okay? I heard about an expedition to Denali, which is the highest mountain in North America. And I thought, some of my climbing friends who were guys were going. And so I wrote and said, I'd like to climb Denali. And they said, no, women can only go as far as base camp and help with the cooking. And I said, what? I said, I'd already done an expedition with my friends from Reed where we climbed higher than Denali. And I said, well, I've already climbed higher than Denali, and I can do more than help with the cooking. And they said, no, women aren't physically strong enough or emotionally stable enough to climb mountains like Denali. And I wasn't invited, my friends were. So I was not happy. Is that hard to believe now? Is anybody incredulous? Story. But anyway, so I thought, well, maybe I can just organize an all women's expedition. So I organized Denali Damsels way back in 1970. This is our 50th anniversary. And it's so sad because they were going to take us to the mountain and helicopter us in to see the camp and have a whole event on Denali for the 50th anniversary. But as you know, due to the pandemic, they just wrote about it in the Park Service magazine instead. But anyway, so, but at that point, we really didn't know if we could climb Denali. And nobody, if any of you have climbed Denali or know about it, people pull, you have to bring 30 days of food, at least you did then, and all this heavy gear. So it's like, you know, a couple 100 pounds of gear, and people pull it on sleds now, just little like plastic sleds, but nobody had thought of it then. So we were carrying these huge loads, like 60 or 70 pounds, and people really didn't know if women could carry those heavy loads, but we could, and we did. And here we are climbing now on the beautiful West Buttress on Denali. And this is our summit morning. We're at 17,000 feet. And I was the deputy leader, but the leader was this woman, Grace Homan, who was a really experienced Alaskan climber. But most peaks in Alaska are not very high. And it turns out she's really not good at altitude. So she is now summit morning having a migraine, feeling terrible. I was the deputy leader. At that point, I was like just 25. And I was like, Grace, maybe you shouldn't go to the summit today, you know, if you're not feeling well. But she really wanted to get to the top. And she did. We all did. It was the first time women, a whole team of women climbed Denali. And here we are on the summit. But Grace, you can see, is kind of slumped down in the snow in that brown jacket. And we went down a little way and she collapsed unconscious. And so that was like a dramatic moment for me. Here I was 25. I was now the leader of this expedition with somebody, our leader, unconscious. And we were right below the summit of Denali, and there was a big Alaskan storm coming in. So, you know, climbing books begin with a critical moment. My memoir begins at this moment. And so we had a pack frame and a sleeping bag. So we put her in the sleeping bag. We made a stretcher with the rope, and then we hauled and lowered her. So you can see if I can find the arrow. Yeah, so there's the summit. That's where Grace collapsed. And then we hauled and lowered her to here. And then we bivvied because it got dark. And I watched those clouds coming in. I still remember how it felt like, oh my gosh, what do we do with an unconscious person if a storm comes in? But fortunately, the storm held off, and we were able to get her down. And as she got down to lower altitude, she started to get better. And now we're getting down to like about 16,000 feet, but there's this big blizzard. And but we got down to the tent at 14,000. And we sat there for like 4 or 5 days, and every 3 hours we had to go shovel off the snow because so much snow was falling in this big blizzard. But for me, that was a huge sort of transformational moment because I'd had a pretty negative upbringing in my childhood, and I remembered sitting in that tent thinking, you know, I did something good. I got Grace down from the summit alive, and I learned later that that was like many years later from the head guide on Denali that he'd never heard of anyone who'd been unconscious on the summit being gotten down alive. The people had died and they'd gotten sick. So it was really a hard thing we had done. So the next big thing in my career is I was finishing my PhD thesis, and I had this precious, I was studying the structure of a molecule called transfer RNA, and I purified this precious vial of transfer RNA to do my last experiment, and I dropped it and it shattered. And what do you do when you're, you know, I went to the movies, and the movie that was playing was called The Endless Summer, which you probably haven't heard about, but it was the Beach Boys going around the world looking for the perfect wave for surfing, which I found off South Africa. And I thought, well, I'm a mountain climber. Maybe I should do an endless winter. So I planned an endless winter for when I finished my PhD with climbs in Europe, Africa, Asia, and New Zealand, and actually did that when I finished my doctorate, and I kept to go quickly. But this is the highest peak in the Ruwenzori Mountains, which are on the border of Uganda and Congo. So when you think of Uganda and Congo, you probably don't think of these high glaciated peaks. And they're really hard to climb because the weather is so bad. There's usually like clouds over them, but we had pretty good weather, and we climbed pretty much all the peaks in the Ruwenzori, lots of peaks in Africa. And my research had been on the structure of transfer RNA. And when I told my PhD advisor I was going to take 1.5 years and go mountain climbing when I got my doctorate, he said, well, you'll never be a scientist. And I said, yes, I will. I'll think about my research. So there I am, the highest point, Uganda and Congo, with my flag saying transfer RNA. And we went to Afghanistan, where we climbed a mountain called Noshak, which was about 24,000 feet. And here I am with my flag that says transfer RNA. This was the 70s, and Afghanistan was this beautiful country. It's just been heartbreaking to me since, you know, the troubles that ever since Russia invaded Afghanistan about 1980, and it's been just really, really sad ever since. But it was beautiful then. And mountain Noshak is about 24,500 feet high. And at that point, all the world's mountains that were 8,000 meters, that's about 28,000 feet, had been climbed by men, but no woman had ever climbed an 8,000 meter peak. And so I was going up Noshak, and I met a Polish expedition coming down with a really strong woman climber. Polish women have really great climbers. And she said, you know, we've climbed to 7,000 meters on Noshak. Let's climb Annapurna together. And that's where the idea first came to climb Annapurna. It was at about 7,000 meters in Afghanistan. So we continued climbing mountains around the world, and I continued going back and forth between climbing and chemistry. And meanwhile, after my endless winter, I became a postdoc in Stanford in biochemistry, looking at how proteins fold. And I was on an expedition in India to an easy mountain called Trisal, with a young man named Bruce Carson, who was at that point America's leading rock climber. He pioneered climbing the steep vertical faces in Yosemite without using pitons. The idea of just putting little nuts in the cracks. And he led people like Yvon Chouinard and Royal Robbins, if those are names, up these faces in India, in Yosemite. And so he was on the expedition. And anyway, it was an easy peak, though it's about 23,000. And I got to the summit. I'm kind of a slow walker, so the others had gotten there first. And the others said that they thought Bruce was lost. And these are his footprints. And he walked to what he thought was, he'd unroped, walked to what he thought was the highest point. And it was a cornice where the snow just hangs over air. There was a 5,000-foot vertical face under the cornice. He fell to his death. So Bruce was 23 and like this leading environmentalist and climber. And I was just devastated. And I just felt like my work with protein folding was meaningless. Everything was meaningless. But I wanted to do something in his memory for the environment. And so I went to see, on my PhD committee at Berkeley was a guy named Bruce Ames, who had a test called the Ames test about whether a chemical was likely to cause cancer. Does it cause mutation changes in bacteria? And I said, I want to do something for the environment in Bruce's memory. And he said, well, could you look at the flame retardants in kids' pajamas? In those days, children's pajamas were 10% by weight, a flame retardant called brominated tris. And he said, I think the chemical might be cancer causing and it might get in children. So we found a little girl whose mom had bought her pajamas in the UK and she'd never worn tris pajamas. And we put her in the tris pajamas and collected her urine. And the first morning there were tris breakdown products that were known cancer causing chemicals of little girl's urine. And every day she wore the pajamas, the amount of chemicals went up. She stopped wearing them and it went down. And so we knew that the tris was getting from the pajamas into the child. And we tested it to see if it changed DNA. Was it a mutagen? And it was a really strong mutagen. And so then like we have to write a paper and tell the parents of America that their kids are wearing these pajamas that could be cancer causing. Then I got invited to go to this mountain. You know what this mountain is? Ready? Mount Everest. And at that point, Mount Everest had only been climbed once by Americans. In 1963, we climbed it. This was 1976, bicentennial, and we were the American bicentennial expedition, and no American woman had even tried to climb Everest. So I had this terrible choice. Was I going to stay and write the paper and tell the parents of America that their kids' pajamas were cancer causing, or was I going to go try to be the first American woman to climb Mount Everest? And if I'm with a live audience, I like to say, how many people would go to Mount Everest and how many people would stay and work on the pajamas? You can see some hands, pajamas. Well, I did both. And so I went to Everest, and while I was hiking through the beautiful Khumbu icefall and fixing ladders over big crevasses, climbing steep ice faces, carrying loads in the Khum, I get to camp every night and write my paper about the tris pajamas. And this is my high point, about 24.5 on Everest. And you can see the Petri dish on the left doesn't have many colonies, no tris. So when you put the tris in, then there's lots of bacterial colonies. So we reached the summit of Everest. We were the second American expedition to do that. And I sent my paper by mail runner from base camp of Everest to Kathmandu, and it was submit to Science, and it was published as a big lead article in Science. We reached the summit in October of 76, bicentennial, and January 77, the paper was published. And the subtitle of this paper says something about what we do now at our institute as scientists. The main flame retardant in children's pajamas is a mutagen and should not be used. So for those of you who read scientific papers, they always end with the same thing at the very end about what needs to be done. You know what that is? More study is needed. And here we did a couple experiments and we made this really strong recommendation that the tris shouldn't be used in kids' pajamas. And in those days, 3 TV networks covered it. That was media in America. Every parent knew. And 3 months after the paper came out, tris treated pajamas were banned by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. However, brominated tris was banned, and the replacement was chlorinated tris. And we did some more studies, found it also looked like it was cancer causing, got into children. It was also removed from furniture, but from pajamas. But what we didn't know is it continued to be used in furniture, which comes later in the story. So on Everest, I learned a lot about organizing high altitude expeditions. On Denali, I learned that women could climb high mountains. And I thought, let's see if all women's group could climb an 8,000 meter peak. And I picked Annapurna 1 because it's relatively low for an 8,000 meter peak. It was the first one ever climbed. And on the way back from Everest in 76, I got a permit for 78 for a women's expedition to Annapurna. Here we are at base camp. We still have reunions. We didn't have ours this year because of COVID, but we'll have one next year, I'm sure. And at the time, what we didn't know is that Annapurna was an extremely dangerous mountain. We wanted to train women Sherpas to be high altitude porters, and we raised the money to fund the expedition selling these t-shirts, which actually are still available on my arleneblum.com website. So the climbing on Annapurna was really beautiful, steep ice faces, huge storms. The reason Annapurna is so dangerous, we've since learned that it's the most dangerous of the 8,000 meter peaks and probably the hardest to climb. And part of the reason is so much snowfalls and big storms, which led to big avalanches, which were terrifying. But climbed like on this very narrow crest of the Dutch Rib. And here we are on the Rib, beautiful place, and on the summit. And two of the Sherpas on our team, two of the women, reached the summit, unfurled an American flag, a women's places on top flag, a Nepalese flag held together by a Save the Whales pin. And so this was the first Americans, the first women to climb Annapurna. And we're very happy. Tragically, there was a second summit attempt, and two of our team fell to their deaths trying to make the second ascent of Annapurna. So after that, I wanted to do a women's expedition that nobody died, that was safe and successful, and I got a permit to a mountain called Brugapont in the Indian Himalayas. It's right next to a mountain called Meru. I don't know if any of you saw, there's a fantastic film about climbing Meru. And so Brugapont is right next to it. And we did make the first ascent of Brugapont. And I was congratulated by Indira Gandhi. And I had always wanted to walk the length of the Himalayas and visit all the wonderful places there. But the borders were closed to foreigners. So I asked her if she could help me get permission, and she did. So I got to spend a wonderful year walking across Bhutan, Sikkim, Nepal, and India. My trekking companion, Hugh Swift, had just written a guidebook to the Himalayas and Karakoram. So he figured out how to get there, and I kind of did the politics and got the permit. We're in a lot of areas that were restricted to Westerners. So we walked up and down across the grain of the land. And everywhere we went, we seemed to arrive on a very auspicious day. In Bhutan, it was their big annual archery festival. People thought we were like visitors from the gods. Most everywhere we were, they'd never seen Westerners before. So we had incredible hospitality. The day we were in Sikkim, the Dalai Lama gave a talk. And it was really in English. It was like inspirational and so coincidental. We entered Nepal on the Day of the Dog, where dogs were fed special treats and had a merry-go-round around their necks. So I continued having adventures doing science, and this is when my daughter Annalise was born. Her dad Rob and I decided to carry her across the Alps with baby, and so this is Patagonia made us the first Gore-Tex baby suit, and this was the first baby pack. It was all made for our trip across the Alps. So anyway, I've written a couple books. Anna Perna tells the story of the women's expedition, and then Breaking Trail tells kind of my memoir of my childhood and all these different expeditions. And I finished Breaking Trail just when Annalise was starting college, and I wanted to go back to science, but I actually had stopped being a scientist for 26 years, and I didn't know that I could go back. And then I learned that the same tryst that we got out of kids' pajamas was back in the nation's furniture. And I thought, it took 3 months to get the tryst out of the baby pajamas in the 70s. So I thought, well, I'll try to work a little bit on getting the bad flame retardants out of the nation's furniture. And to do that, I ended up founding the Green Science Policy Institute. And we're mostly PhD scientists who pick research projects that can have impact on public health, that are public interest. And we write papers in very good journals and bring decision makers from business and government together to change things, and we communicate our results. And so we've been very successful at changing government policy and also manufacturing and business purchasing. So I'll be telling you more about that now. So the problem is that in America, there's only one law about chemicals before they go out in the environment. It's called TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act. And when it passed, 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered, and even asbestos, which causes 10,000 deaths a year, could not be regulated. Asbestos is regulated by lawsuits, but everybody who wins an asbestos lawsuit tends to die, so it's not a good way to regulate things. Asbestos exposure leads to mesothelioma, which is an always fatal cancer, so not good. But it's still, asbestos couldn't be regulated by the Toxic Substance Control Act. So the act has been revised, and hopefully things are going to start getting better, but the way it has been for a long time is old chemicals were grandfathered, and new chemicals, no data was required. So like the tryst was just grandfathered and it could be used, and if there was a new chemical, nobody had to have data about it. Another big problem with chemicals, remember brominated tryst was phased out to replace what was chlorinated tryst, same structure, function, toxicity. And this is a flame retardant on the left called 10-deca-bromo diphenyl ether. And if you have an old television, your television, the plastic, about 20% of the weight of your plastic on your TV will be that decabromo ether. And with years of scientific research and advocacy, it was determined that that chemical was persistent, accumulated in people and the environment, was toxic, came out of the television. So if you turn on the television, it would come up dust, people be exposed. And so the decabromo diphenyl ether on the left was phased out. But if you have a newer television, 20% of the weight will be the molecule on the right, which looks almost identical, the decabromo diphenyl ethane. It's pretty much the same except for a different, an ethane bond here and an ether bond here, if you remember your chemistry. And it turned out to be just as persistent, bioactive, and toxic. And so that's what's called a regrettable substitute. When something's phased out, the replacement is something almost identical in structure, function, and toxicity. So this is not a good thing with tens of thousands of chemicals and this regrettable substitute problem. And if you think about trying to evaluate tens of thousands of chemicals, it just can seem overwhelming. What are you going to do? So we had a retreat with people from business and science and government who really wanted to solve this problem and came up with the idea of sorting all these chemicals into families or classes. So we came up with 6 classes or families that contain the majority of harmful chemicals in everyday products. And these are the 6 classes. And we have made 4-minute videos around each of the classes. So if you go to 6classes.org, in a half an hour, you can watch an introductory video and 6 4-minute videos, and you can learn about where these chemicals are used, why they're harmful, and lots of hints on what you can do to reduce exposure. Now, if a chemical is one of these classes, it still might be useful and necessary. So we're not saying you can't use any of these, but ask, is it really necessary? Is it worth it? If you say to a mom, you can have a beautiful stain repellent carpet, but the PFAS stain repellent is harmful and it's going to be in your children's bodies for years and on the planet forever, the mom might think maybe she doesn't need a white, very stain repellent carpet. Maybe she could have a dark carpet instead, that it's not worth it. But if she really wants that white carpet that you can drop Coca-Cola and chocolate ice cream on, then is there a safer alternative? Can green chemistry be? And so that's a good way of thinking about these classes. So I'm going to tell you about two of them today, and it's kind of why they're problematic, and then some inspiring stories about what our institute's been able to do to help solve these problems. So my favorite class is called PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substance. It's a big mouthful. And the reason it's my favorite is because they're so good and they're so bad. They're so good at water repellency. So your Gore-Tex jacket, your Teflon fry pan, that's made with PFAS. Things that are stain repellent and water repellent usually have PFAS. So they're useful. They're so bad because the carbon fluorine bond is so strong that it never, ever breaks. So these PFAS that are used to make your Gore-Tex jacket or your Teflon frying pan will be on the planet forever, a million years from now. So they're called forever chemicals. And there are two of them that are been used for years. They're called C8s, where there's 8 carbons surrounded by fluorines. And one is called the acid. It has a carboxylic acid at the end, and PFOA, and one is called PFAS with a sulfonic group in it. And they're used for water repellency, also for firefighting foam. If there's an oil fire, they use PFAS, PFOS, to put out the fire. So started hearing of problems about PFOA, which is used to manufacture Teflon in the Ohio River Valley. A manufacturing plant released a lot of PFOA into water and air, and the people had contaminated drinking water and lots of health problems. And a lawyer, Rob Ballot, sued DuPont, whose plant it was, and won a settlement, and they used it to do epidemiology studies of 40,000 people. It's called the C8 Health Study. And that story is in the film Dark Water. Anybody seen Dark Waters? So I really recommend it. It's an excellent film about the story of Rob Ballot, who discovered the PFOA contamination. He's played by Mark Ruffalo, who's a famous actor and environmentalist, and his wife's Anne Hathaway. Anyway, it's a great film, so I recommend Dark Waters. And it's about the C8 Health Study, which found that exposure to PFOA was linked to 2 kinds of cancer, high cholesterol, obesity, and a whole range of other health problems. And also, just about everybody has these chemicals in their body. So, meanwhile, my work on these PFAS began trekking in the Himalayas. In about 2012, I was trekking, reading a book called Stain-Resistant, Non-Stick, Waterproof, and Lethal: The Hidden Dangers of C8. And I was trekking with a scientist who studied PFAS, and everything I read in the book, she said, yes, that's true. So I came back after reading this book, and I wanted to, I looked online to see if there'd been newspaper articles, and sorry, actually the newspaper articles, and there really was no information much in the paper at all about PFAS. So I started a scientist group. I invited scientists from around the world who studied PFAS to have monthly calls. And we've been having monthly calls since 2012. We had one this morning. They're on Wednesdays, Wednesday of the month. and we shared a lot of information. We started by writing a statement called the Madrid Statement on these chemicals, calling on the international community to cooperate in limiting the production and use of these chemicals and developing safer alternatives. And this was signed by 230 scientists. And after writing the statement, we did a lot of publicity. And that hadn't happened before. So National Geographic covered it, the New York Times. If any of you get really interested in PFAS, there's an amazing series in The Intercept called The Teflon Toxin by a woman named Sharon Lerner. And it's really, really a great series. But the story that made the biggest difference was the New York Times Magazine cover story about Rob Bilott. In fact, this story is what was made into the movie Dark Waters, the lawyer who became DuPont's worst nightmare, telling about how he uncovered this problem of PFAS. And this all changed everything. The EPA, there was at that point, nobody knew what's a safe level for PFAS in water. And the EPA was under pressure to regulate PFAS after all this publicity. And so meanwhile, the EPA had looked in water systems around the country and discovered that a lot of our drinking water was contaminated with PFAS. And some EPA scientists on our call said, this is a huge problem. Nobody's doing anything about it. And I thought, well, I wonder if we can trace back from contaminated drinking water to the source. And Elsie Sunderland, who's a professor at Harvard, was on our call. And she said, I have a student, Cindy, who was really good at mapping. And Cindy can map back from the communities with contaminated drinking water to the sources. And so Cindy made this map and discovered that the sources of the PFAS were industrial production sites, military training areas, and just as the paper was getting finished, the EPA set a health advisory level, and they said that if there's more than 70 parts per trillion of PFAS in drinking water, that this is problematic for health. And we were able to calculate that 6 million people in America had drinking water above the health advisory level. And so since then, that health advisory level has been going down. It was 70 for the EPA, which said 6 million people, but a lot of states are finding much lower levels, and as much as perhaps 100 million people's drinking water is contaminated. So this is a huge, huge problem. And meanwhile, the problems with C8 had been known since the 60s, but in 2015, 50 years after the health problems were known, the chemical industry voluntarily phased out C8. It's on the molecules on the left, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. And the replacement on the right, can you guess? C6. And do you think it's an improvement? No. C6 is just as persistent, never breaks down, bioaccumulates in plants. It's being found to be equally toxic, and it's smaller, moves faster. And so the filters that filter out the C8 don't even filter out the C6. So it's your regrettable substitution. But the chemical industry is advertising that it's just fine. They advertise things are PFOA-free, that they have C6, and right, they say C6 is safe because it can't break down to C8. And if you're a chemist, you think a molecule with 6 carbons can't break down to one that's got 8 carbons, but that doesn't mean it's safe. So meanwhile, most products, food packaging, outdoor stuff, have being made with C6 instead of C8, the regrettable substitute. An example of a PFAS sad story is Wolverine made shoes called Hush Puppies, and they treated the leather with Scotchgard, which is PFAS, and they dumped the scrap in fields and applied sludge, and then built a suburb on the fields. And the drinking water in that suburb was like over 800 times the health advisory level, and a lot of the people had the health problems associated with PFAS. So there are a lot of lawsuits. A year ago, the state of Michigan sued Wolverine for contaminating the environment, and Wolverine agreed to pay Michigan like nearly $70 million, but then Wolverine sued 3M for making the chemical and selling it to them, and they're paying Wolverine $55 million. And there are stories like this all over the country. In North Carolina, there's a DuPont plant, now it's Chemours plant, that made different PFAS and totally contaminated the Cape Fear River to build a plant to use carbon to filter out the long chain, the C8s. $46 million to build it, nearly $3 million a year to operate it, but that doesn't filter out the small ones. And so reverse osmosis does, and that costs twice as much to build the plant and still nearly $3 million to operate it. So this is super expensive. And all it does is get the PFAS out of the water. A scientist friend of mine, Detlef Knopp, who was the first to write about the PFAS in Cape Fear region, he said in North Carolina, when it rained and the rain went through the trees, the level of PFAS went up. And that's because the exhaust from the plant filtered, landed on the trees. And so you can spend all this money to give people clean drinking water, but what about the birds and the bees and the bats that live in the trees? So the environment is contaminated, and cleaning up the environment is virtually impossible. So PFAS are problematic, difficult to clean up. Everybody's looking very depressed. Prevention is preferable. So the next is going to be good stories about using science for prevention. So we'd heard that PFAS was used to make food packaging non-stick. And so we went around Berkeley to the organic restaurants and groceries, and we got food packaging and we tested it, and about half of it contained PFAS. And then we did a study of 400 samples of fast food packaging, and again, about half of it contained PFAS. It's like dessert and bread wrappers and sandwich and burger wrappers. And so we wrote a paper about it. We did a lot of publicity, many articles, and people in the Senate noticed. Senator Blumenthal wrote letters like to the CEO of Burger King saying, why are you using PFAS on your burger wraps? And we later learned that when we wrote this paper, the fast food industry realized they were going to have to move away from PFAS, and they started looking for alternatives that were effective, not too costly, and gradually moving away from it. And about a couple months ago, McDonald's announced they were out of PFAS in all their McDonald's all over the world. And they said they were out of it, most of it within a year after our paper came out, but it took a long time. So again, it's an example. You write a scientific paper, you communicate, you publicize it, and it's changed. So on the way out, a lot of states now are having legislation that not allowing any PFAS in food packaging. Yes. Carpeting is one of the biggest sources. Carpeting is one of the biggest sources. Just 1 minute. I can't do the talk with someone in this room. I'm sorry. My friend, it's just too distracting. I'll be done. Carpeting has been shown to be the largest source of exposure for children. And we started working with the carpet industry. They're based in Dalton, Georgia, and they came to Berkeley, and we explained to them, they'd all switched from C8 to C6. And we explained to them that C6, showed them all the data that C6 was not a good substitute. And they decided at our meeting, they commit to removing PFAS from all US carpeting within 2 years. And January of this year, January 1st, they said all PFAS was out of carpeting in the United States. And at that point, Home Depot announced they were not going to sell any carpets and rugs containing any PFAS. And that happened because the carpet industry had been educated by the science and made a decision. And they were very happy that they had phased out PFAS, and they found other ways to make carpeting waterproofing without any PFAS. A good success story is Keen shoes. They're outdoor shoes. I don't know if any of you know Keens. And they decided they wanted to remove all PFAS from their shoes. And they looked and they found in their different range of shoes that there were PFAS in 101 places in their shoes. And they looked again, and 70 places the PFAS weren't necessary and were removed. But the other 31 were really hard. It took them years of work, but they found replacements for the other 31. And what we're really thinking is we only want to use chemicals like PFAS if they're essential. If they're not necessary, we can stop using them. And then if they're necessary, let's find safer alternatives. And that's what Keen did. And right now, Keen is working with us to share this with the whole manufacturing industry, the outdoor industry, because the outdoor industry still uses a lot of PFAS, for water repellency. And we say, maybe you need PFAS if you're climbing Mount Everest, but you don't need it, to go grocery shopping. There are other ways you can get water repellency. So all these brands commit to not using PFAS. Some of them, like IKEA and Crate and Barrel and Levi's, we work with, and others were picketed by Greenpeace, who the PFAS is put on in China. It's interesting. Greenpeace Germany was picketing these companies in Europe and the US to prevent contamination of drinking water in China, and successfully. All these companies commit to Greenpeace. They would stop using all PFAS. In the US, we were able to work with people in the House and Senate. This turns out to not be a partisan issue. Contaminated communities across the country, and when people's drinking water is contaminated, they're pretty loud complaining about it. And so people from both sides of the aisle supported PFAS legislation. The military budget, it's called the National Defense Authorization Act, was a good place to put in requirements. Very important for the military to phase out PFAS use in firefighting foams. Practice with PFAS firefighting foams is contaminated, a major source of contamination of drinking water throughout the country. Airports, again, practice with firefighting foams. And so that, again, we have legislation that domestic airports would no longer be required to use PFAS firefighting foam. So things, even in the last administration, we were able to do a lot, and Biden has prioritized PFAS in his agenda. Designating as a hazardous substance, accelerating research. So we're feeling really optimistic that this is going to be on the way out. So PFAS is out of carpets, going out of food packaging, out of furnishings, we hope out of outdoor gear and clothing, and out of firefighting foam. So this is all good news. If you get really interested in PFAS, like I am, you can tell I'm a PFAS enthusiast. We have a website called PFAS Central, where there's now so many articles, scientific articles, news articles. So we have the latest on news, policy, PFAS jobs, PFAS events. And the most popular page, oops, I don't have a slide of it, is a PFAS-free page that lists products like Keen shoes that don't have any PFAS, Kia. And the people in communities who've been drinking contaminated drinking water asked us to make a list of companies that didn't use PFAS. Okay, well, I'm going to speak briefly now about flame retardants. They were put into a lot of products, assuming that they would help prevent fires and they weren't harmful. It turns out in many cases they don't help prevent fires and they are harmful. There was a standard in California for furniture foam. So the foam inside furniture was required to withstand a little candle flame, and to do that, the foam inside of furniture was like 5% by weight, a toxic flame retardant like that chlorinated tris that we gotten out of kids' pajamas. And in fact, that's what was there, and that was and I learned that chlorinated, when I wanted to come back to science, I learned that chlorinated tris was back in the nation's furniture. And I remembered in the 70s how easy it was to write a scientific paper and everything changed. So I thought we'd write a paper saying that and talking about the harmful flame retardants in furniture. And another one that was used called Penta causes a lot of neurological problems. children of women with high levels of very problematic chemical, the PentaBDE, which was replaced by the chlorinated tris. And how do the flame retardants end up in us? They're what's called semi-volatile. So they come out of furniture. They're always coming out. They're heavy. They drop into dust. You eat a sandwich, you have a little dust on your hand. You're eating flame retardants. Cats who groom their fur can have 10 to 100 times higher levels than humans. And unfortunately, toddlers and young children who crawl in the dust and put their hands in their mouth can have high levels of flame retardants. So, and we discovered that meeting that standard didn't make furniture more fire safe because the foam wouldn't burn for 12 seconds. But if you imagine dropping a candle on a couch, the fabric will burn and then the foam burns. And there was really no difference in fire safety with and without the flame retardants. So we decided to do some bills to change. It's a California standard, but it was followed across all of the US and Canada. So basically all the furniture and children's products foam was treated with these harmful chemicals. And we had a lot of support from scientists, the community. Firefighters supported this because they realized the flame retardants didn't help, and when they burned, they gave off cancer-causing chemicals that the firefighters were exposed to. So everybody supported not using flame retardants in furniture anymore, except Californians for Fire Safety, who turned out to be the manufacturers of the flame retardants. And when it looked like we were going to have a bill that was going to pass, that was going to change the rules so that the furniture fires would stop in the fabric, so you could actually have greater fire safety without any flame retardants. And this was part of a $7 million one-week advertising campaign to prevent our standard. So it was really, really hard. The chemical industry was, they spent a documented $23 million preventing California moving to a new standard that would increase fire safety without flame retardants. So we wrote a scientific consensus statement, again signed by a couple hundred scientists, published it in Environmental Perspectives, got the word out about the harm and lack of benefit. But the thing that changed everything was the series in the Chicago Tribune called Playing with Fire. I recommend it. It's full of scandal, and the subtitle says everything. A deceptive campaign by industry brought toxic flame retardants into our homes and into our bodies, and the chemicals don't even work as promised. And this series won many, many journalism prizes. And meanwhile, I had started hiking with Jerry Brown, senior advisor. In those days, anybody who went hiking with me got a whole earful about flame retardants. And so he had educated the governor, and the governor wanted to change the California standard, but the chemical industry would have just spent a fortune advertising that the state was going to burn down. But then after this series came down exposing the chemical industries, that the chemicals didn't work and that they were harmful, he was able to change the law. And so now, if you go to buy furniture, there'll be a label and it will be checked, contains no added flame retardants. And so that's a huge deal. That's across all of America and Canada. And so all American homes, if you have a couch, this was passed in about 2014, the transition. If you have a couch purchased since then, it won't contain flame retardants. So it makes every American home healthier. And my glamour slide, because of that, and Jerry Brown really appreciated doing that, I was elected to the California Hall of Fame with some of my heroes. There's Robert Redford on the left, and Joan Baez on the right, and the famous baseball player, Fernando Valenzuela. So that was all from taking good science and using it to change policy. So again, I encourage people to go to sixclasses.org, take a half an hour, learn about the chemicals so you can make healthier choices, your own purchase. We send out quarterly newsletters about mountain climbing and science. You can go to my website, arleneblum.com/contact, or you can go to the Six Classes website or Green Science Policy, any of our websites. You can sign up for my quarterly newsletter or monthly newsletters that are all about science. So by reducing the use of PFAS and flame retardants in our Six Classes, we can have a healthier world. This is a nice view of Mount Rainier from Goat Rocks Wilderness Area in Washington State. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we go to see who's here, and we can answer questions. I'll stop the share.